It doesn't happen often in the NFL. A Hall of Famer stopping mid-take, looking back at months of criticism and publicly saying, "I was wrong." But that's exactly what just happened. Cris Carter, one of the loudest and most relentless critics of Shedeur Sanders, has officially waved the white flag, and the timing makes it even more unbelievable. For months, Carter questioned everything, not just Shedeur's arm, not just his athleticism. He questioned his mindset, his preparation, and even his upbringing. At one point, Carter went as far as suggesting Shedeur was nothing more than a late-round gamble, a fifth-rounder riding hype instead of substance. Those weren't casual critiques. They were statements that shaped public opinion and fueled doubt across the football world. And now Carter is apologizing. This wasn't a quiet walk back or a carefully worded clarification. It was a full reversal. The same voice that tried to cool the hype is now admitting he misjudged the talent, the trajectory, and the moment. That alone should make you stop and ask, what changed so drastically that someone like Cris Carter felt forced to own it publicly? The answer lies in Cleveland. Once the Cleveland Browns made it clear they're building toward the future with Shedeur Sanders at the center, the conversation shifted overnight. Narratives that once sounded confident suddenly looked shaky. And critics who spent months tearing him down were left with a choice: double down or admit they missed it. Carter didn't just admit it, he went further. He even suggested the Browns move on from another quarterback entirely, a move that sent shockwaves through NFL media. That's not a minor adjustment, that's a full 180. And what makes this moment so powerful isn't just the apology itself, it's what it represents. Because Carter isn't the only one revering course, and this might be the clearest sign yet that something bigger is happening right in front of us. It's one thing for a media personality to quietly soften their stance. It's something completely different for a Hall of Famer to stop everything and publicly admit they got it wrong. That's what made this moment hit so hard. Cris Carter, one of the most vocal skeptics of Shedeur Sanders, didn't just change his tone, he surrendered the argument entirely. For months, Carter positioned himself as the voice of realism while everyone else in his view was buying into hype. He questioned Shedeur's arm strength, his size, his athletic ceiling, and most notably his readiness for the NFL spotlight. These weren't throwaway comments. Carter repeatedly framed Shedeur as a quarterback who benefited from protection and image rather than adversity, someone who hadn't been tested the right way. That framing stuck, especially coming from a respected Hall of Famer whose opinions carry real weight. So when Carter suddenly came out and said, "I made a mistake," it stopped people cold. This wasn't a soft pivot, it wasn't, "I still have concerns," but it was a direct acknowledgement that his evaluation was wrong. That alone made the moment feel surreal. Analysts argue all the time, they almost never apologize, especially not like this. What made the flip even more jarring was the timing. Carter's reversal came right after the Cleveland Browns made it clear that Shedeur Sanders is central to their future plans. Once that message went public, the ground shifted. Takes that once sounded confident suddenly looked fragile, and Carter, instead of doubling down, chose to step back and own it. That decision matters more than people realize. Carter didn't just admit he underestimated talent, he admitted he misread the moment, the player, and the direction things were heading. In a media world where stubbornness is often rewarded with attention, that kind of honesty stands out. And here's the part that really changed the temperature. Carter didn't stop at an apology. He followed it by openly endorsing Shedeur's role as a long-term starter, even suggesting the Browns move on from other options because, in his view, the decision had already been made. That's not hedging, that's conviction. This wasn't just a flip, it was the collapse of a narrative that had been building for months. And once that narrative cracked, it opened the door for something bigger, because Carter wouldn't be the last critic forced to rethink what they said. To understand why this reversal feels so shocking, you have to go back and look at just how far the criticism went. This wasn't normal quarterback debate. This wasn't a disagreement over mechanics or scheme fit. Cris Carter didn't just question the game, he questioned the player. Over and over, Carter framed Shedeur Sanders as someone who lacked the physical tools to survive at the next level. Not a strong enough arm, not big enough, not athletic enough. Those critiques alone would have been controversial, but Carter didn't stop there. He went after Shedeur's mentality, suggesting the pressure of the NFL would expose him once the spotlight got hotter and the margin for error disappeared. Then came the comments that really stuck. Carter openly argued that Shedeur's success was inflated, that it was a product of environment rather than ability. He pushed the idea that playing under his father had shielded him from adversity instead of preparing him for it. According to that narrative, Shedeur wasn't battle-tested, he was protected. and in the NFL, that accusation cuts deep. The most damaging moment came when Carter publicly said Shedeur should be viewed as nothing more than a fifth-round pick, not a developmental first, not a risky second, a fifth-rounder. That label matters. Draft positioning shapes careers, expectations, and opportunity. When a respected Hall of Famer puts that kind of stamp on a quarterback, it doesn't just spark debate, it hardens opinions. And the criticism didn't stay on the field. Carter blurred the line between evaluation and character. He questioned preparation. He questioned leadership. He questioned whether Shedeur had earned his reputation or inherited it. Once those ideas entered the conversation, they spread fast. Fans repeated them. Analysts echoed them. Doubt became the default reaction in certain circles. What made it worse was how confident the messaging sounded. There was no hesitation. No, we'll see. Carter spoke like the book was already written, like the ceiling was capped, like the outcome was inevitable. And that kind of certainty leaves very little room for growth in the public eye. That's why the apology hit differently. You don't walk back mild skepticism with this much force. You don't reverse a take that aggressive unless reality leaves you no choice. The depth of the doubt explains the weight of the reversal, because when someone spends months dismissing a player entirely, admitting they were wrong isn't just uncomfortable. It's exposing. And once those old statements are replayed next to what's happening now, the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. What finally snapped this debate in half wasn't a hot take or a viral clip. It was an organizational decision. Once the Cleveland Browns made their direction clear, the conversation around Shedeur Sanders changed almost instantly. And not because analysts suddenly felt nicer, but because reality left them no room to hide. NFL teams don't speak loudly unless they mean it. When Cleveland began signaling that Shedeur was central to their long-term plans, this wasn't framed as a temporary experiment or a let's-see-what-happens situation. It was confidence, internal confidence, the kind that comes from what coaches see in meetings, what executives hear in evaluations, and what shows up consistently on film behind closed doors. That's the stuff fans don't always see, but media members definitely understand. This is where narratives started to crack. For months, critics could lean on hypotheticals. They could talk about what might happen when defenses get faster or windows get tighter. But once the Browns aligned their future around Shedeur, those hypotheticals lost power. You don't restructure plans, shape rosters, and recalibrate timelines around a quarterback you don't believe in. And that decision put critics in a corner. When a franchise commits, it forces a reckoning. Either the team is reckless or the evaluation was wrong. There's not much middle ground. The Browns weren't hedging. They weren't splitting the room. They were planting a flag. And once that happened, analysts who had spent months dismissing Shedeur had to confront a simple truth. The people whose jobs depend on being right were seeing something different. That's when the tone shifted. Not all at once, not publicly at first, but you could hear it. Language softened, certainty disappeared. Statements that once sounded definitive suddenly came with qualifiers. And for someone like Cris Carter, that pressure was impossible to ignore. A Hall of Famer understands how front offices think. He understands what commitment looks like, and when Cleveland made theirs clear, pretending nothing had changed would have looked irresponsible. This wasn't about hype anymore, it was about alignment. Coaching staffs, executives, and decision-makers were moving in one direction while old takes were stuck pointing the other way. And when those paths diverge, the takes don't age well. That's why this moment matters so much. The Browns didn't just endorse a quarterback, they forced the football world to recalibrate. Once that happened, denial became louder than doubt. And the closer Cleveland leaned in, the harder it became for critics to pretend they hadn't missed something obvious. And that pressure didn't just lead to apologies, it opened the door for something even bigger, a complete reversal of belief. The apology alone was enough to raise eyebrows, but what came after it is what truly changed the tone. Cris Carter didn't just admit he misjudged Shedeur Sanders, he flipped his entire stance in a way that left almost no room for interpretation. Instead of stopping at "I was wrong," Carter took it several steps further. He openly said that now that the Cleveland Browns have made their direction clear, they should move on from other quarterback options immediately. In particular, Carter suggested the Browns should trade Dillon Gabriel and get whatever value they can while they still have the chance. That recommendation landed like a thunderclap. Think about how drastic that is. This is the same analyst who, just months earlier, was arguing Shedeur didn't belong anywhere near the top of an NFL depth chart. The same voice that once framed him as overhyped and limited is now saying there's no reason to even keep another quarterback in the picture. That's not cautious optimism, that's confidence, and it signals something far bigger than an apology. When a media figure tells a franchise to clear the runway for one player, they're doing more than praising talent. They're acknowledging inevitability. Carter wasn't hedging. He wasn't saying, let's see how it plays out. He was saying the decision has already been made and everyone else just needs to catch up. That's what makes this moment so powerful. The flip wasn't gradual. It wasn't subtle. It was a clean break from everything Carter had been pushing before. One minute, Shedeur was portrayed as a risky projection. The next, he was being framed as the guy you build around without hesitation. That kind of swing doesn't happen unless the evidence becomes overwhelming. And it also reveals something else. Apologies can be performative. Recommendations are not. When Carter went on record saying the Browns should move on from another quarterback because Shedeur is that guy, he tied his credibility to the take. There's no easy retreat from that position. If he's wrong again, everyone will remember it. That's why this wasn't just a change of heart, it was a full commitment. Carter wasn't trying to soften the blow of his earlier criticism. He was rewriting his evaluation entirely. And in doing so, he signaled that the conversation around Shedeur Sanders had crossed a point of no return. Once critics stop debating if and start debating how much, the narrative is already gone. And from that moment on, this story stopped being about doubt and started being about who would be next to admit they missed it. Once Cris Carter broke the seal, it didn't stop with him. That's when the pattern became impossible to ignore. One by one, some of the loudest critics who had spent months casting doubt were suddenly forced to recalibrate, not because of social pressure, but because the evidence kept piling up. What fans started calling the apology tour wasn't coordinated, it was reactive. It began earlier with Rex Ryan, whose criticism had been blunt and highly public. Ryan questioned Shedeur Sanders not just as a player, but as a leader. He openly doubted whether Shedeur could command an NFL offense or handle the responsibility that comes with being the face of a franchise. Those comments carried weight because they came from a former head coach, someone who'd been in those rooms. But once the tape started stacking up, even Ryan had to change direction. The same voice that once dismissed Shedeur's future began praising his composure, his football IQ, and the way he controlled games. That wasn't a tweak, it was a reversal. Then came Tony Grossi, and this is where things got tense. Grossi's skepticism wasn't subtle. Throughout camps and early evaluations, he consistently pushed negative interpretations of Shedeur's progress. At times, the criticism crossed from performance into implication, especially around injuries and toughness. Fans noticed. The discourse heated up, but eventually the contrast on the field became too sharp to ignore. Once the difference between Shedeur and other options became obvious, Grossi's tone shifted, slowly at first, then unmistakably. He didn't frame it as an apology, but the conclusion was the same: Shedeur was the future. Mary Kay Cabot followed a similar path, though more gradually. Early concerns about readiness and ceiling kept resurfacing in her coverage. But each time doubt was raised, Shedeur answered it with another steady performance. Over time, the questions stopped leading the conversation. The play did, and eventually acknowledgement replaced hesitation. What connects all of these moments isn't ego or embarrassment, it's repetition. One good game can be dismissed, two can be debated, but consistent performance forces honesty. At a certain point, denial starts to look intentional. That's when credibility comes into play. This is why the apology tour matters. It's not about fans winning arguments online. It's about how quickly confident narratives collapse when they're built on assumption instead of patience. These reversals weren't sparked by hype. They were dragged into existence by film, results, and decisions made inside the building. And once multiple respected voices start walking back their words, the story stops being about whether Shedeur Sanders belongs and starts being about how many people misread him before it was too late to pretend otherwise. Here's the part that gets misunderstood the most. What changed wasn't the hype around Shedeur Sanders. The hype was always there. What changed was the evidence. And once that evidence stacked up, it became impossible to explain away. For a long time, critics leaned on projection. They talked about what Shedeur might struggle with instead of what he was actually doing. Faster defenses, smaller windows, more pressure, all fair questions until the answers started showing up on tape. What teams and analysts began seeing wasn't flash or improvisation. It was control, calm footwork, quick processing, the ability to get the ball out on time and put it where it needed to be, even when the play broke down. The biggest shift was decision-making. Shedeur stopped being framed as a quarterback surviving off structure and started being recognized as one who commands it. He wasn't forcing throws. He wasn't panicking when the pocket collapsed. He was diagnosing, adjusting, and taking what the defense gave him. That's not hype, that's growth. Then there was leadership, the part that doesn't show up in box scores. Teammates responded to him. Coaches trusted him. You could see it in how offenses moved with purpose, not hesitation. When things went wrong, he didn't spiral, he stabilized. That matters more than arm strength debates ever will. NFL teams don't just draft talent, they invest in steadiness. Another key factor was how Shedeur handled criticism itself. While narratives swirled and comments got personal, he didn't clap back. He didn't fuel drama. He didn't turn press conferences into defenses of his name. He kept working. That restraint stood out, especially in an era where young players often feel pressured to respond publicly. Silence, in this case, became proof of confidence. And yes, some of the early skepticism was tied to outside narratives, particularly the constant focus on Deion Sanders. It's been said by some that evaluations were clouded by assumptions about privilege and protection rather than preparation. That idea has floated around, but what matters now is that it no longer holds weight. Once performance repeats, speculation fades. This is why so many critics reversed course at the same time, not because they suddenly believed, but because the gap between what they said and what was happening became too wide to ignore. Film forces honesty. You can debate opinions forever, but you can't argue with consistency. So when people ask what changed, the answer is simple. The game slowed down for Shedeur Sanders, and once that happens, the conversation changes with it. Here's the part of this story that rarely gets said out loud. These apologies aren't just about football, they're about credibility. When you're a media figure, especially one with a long resume and a loud voice, being wrong once is forgivable. Being wrong on tape repeatedly while the evidence stacks up in the opposite direction is something else entirely. That's the position many analysts found themselves in with Shedeur Sanders. Early criticism is easy. It gets attention, it signals authority. But when that criticism hardens into certainty, when someone is labeled limited, overhyped, or unworthy before their story is written, the risk skyrockets. Because once the player proves otherwise, those old takes don't disappear. They get replayed, side by side, word for word. That's why the reversals started happening before things got even bigger. For someone like Cris Carter, doubling down would have been the worst possible move. Hall of Famers understand legacy. They know how fast opinions age when results contradict them. Carter didn't just apologize because he felt bad, he apologized because pretending nothing had changed would have damaged his credibility far more than admitting a mistake. And he wasn't alone. Across sports media, the tone shifted almost defensively. Not celebratory, not excited, careful. Analysts began choosing words more precisely. Confidence gave way to caution. Because once a quarterback starts producing consistently, every old take becomes a receipt, and no one wants to be remembered as the person who missed it completely. There's also another layer people don't like to confront. Some of the early skepticism around Shedeur wasn't just about football. It's been said by fans and commentators that assumptions about his background, his father, and his perceived protection influenced evaluations more than film did. That idea has circulated quietly for a while. Whether intentional or not, perception crept into analysis. And when performance exposed that bias, it made the misread even more uncomfortable. That's why these apologies feel rushed. It's not about humility, it's about timing. Being early to correct yourself looks responsible, being late looks stubborn. Media figures understand that once a player becomes undeniable, the narrative flips from "was he good?" to "how did you miss this?" And that question lingers. Because every time Cleveland Browns lean further into Shedeur as their guy, the old doubts grow louder in hindsight. Silence doesn't erase them, soft pivots don't erase them, only ownership does. That's the uncomfortable truth. These apologies aren't closing the story, they're trying to get ahead of it. Because if Shedeur Sanders keeps ascending, history won't be kind to the loudest doubters, and everyone in media knows it. What makes this story different from so many others in the NFL isn't just the turnaround in opinion. It's how Shedeur Sanders handled every stage of it. When the doubt was loud, he stayed quiet. When the criticism got personal, he didn't respond. And when the same voices that once dismissed him started walking things back, he didn't celebrate it publicly. He just kept playing. That's the part that gets overlooked. Plenty of players talk about being motivated by disrespect. Very few actually let their performance do all the talking. Shedeur never turned this into a public feud. He didn't chase validation from analysts. He didn't try to win arguments online. Instead, he stayed focused on preparation, execution, and growth, the unglamorous parts that don't trend but always show up on Sundays. And now look at where things stand. The same analysts who once labeled him a late-round gamble are openly discussing his ceiling as a franchise quarterback. The same people who questioned his mindset are now praising his poise. That kind of reversal doesn't happen because of spin. It happens because performance becomes too consistent to deny. When growth keeps repeating, narratives collapse under their own weight. For the Cleveland Browns, the message is already clear. They're not hedging. They're not waiting for perfect conditions. They've chosen a direction and it runs straight through their young quarterback. That commitment matters because organizations don't make those calls lightly. They do it when they believe the foundation is real. What we're seeing now is accountability catching up to commentary. Old takes don't vanish just because opinions change, they linger. And that's why these apologies feel so significant. Not because they fix the past, but because they acknowledge it. In a media world where doubling down is often rewarded, owning a mistake takes more courage than pretending it never happened. But here's the real takeaway: this story isn't about revenge. It's not about rubbing old quotes in anyone's face. It's about what happens when belief meets discipline. Shedeur Sanders didn't demand respect, he earned it, slowly, repeatedly, without noise. And this chapter still isn't finished. As he continues to develop, as expectations rise, and as the spotlight grows brighter, even more people will be forced to revisit what they once said. Some will apologize, some will quietly shift tone, others will stay silent, but the record won't change. So the question now is whether the critics were wrong. That part is already clear. The real question is what we do with that lesson going forward. Do we allow young players room to grow, or do we keep writing endings before the story unfolds? Because if this has shown us anything, it's that patience reveals more than prediction ever could. And Shedeur Sanders is proving that the loudest response is often the one you never have to make at all.